Canada's indigenous languages face an urgent crisis stemming from a legacy of colonial oppression. Before colonization, a diverse array of over 70 languages flourished, each integral to unique cultural identities. However, assimilation policies, especially the destructive residential school system, severely suppressed these languages, leading to widespread endangerment and intergenerational trauma. The resulting language loss represents a profound cultural and historical tragedy. Despite recent government initiatives like the Indigenous Languages Act, significant hurdles remain. While funding has been allocated, implementation faces challenges including inefficient resources for bilingual education, a shortage of trained teachers, and persistent systemic discrimination. True revitalization requires not only financial support but also a fundamental shift in societal attitudes and a commitment to empowering indigenous communities to lead their own language preservation efforts. The study of indigenous language rights in Canada is paramount. The loss of these languages is not simply a loss of words. It represents the erosion of unique cultural perspectives, traditional ecological knowledge, and vital cultural practices passed down through generations. This loss profoundly impacts the well-being of indigenous communities and the richness of Canadian society as a whole. We must also address the historical injustices inflicted by residential schools which systematically suppress indigenous languages, creating lasting intergenerational trauma. This necessitates a thorough examination of the link between these historical policies and current language vitality. Furthermore, we need to assess the effectiveness of the Indigenous Languages Act, ensuring that its support reaches the grassroots programs struggling to maintain and revitalize these essential languages within their communities. This presentation seeks to answer three key research questions. First, we will examine how specific colonial policies, such as the residential school system, directly contributed to the endangerment of indigenous languages. Second, we will assess the extent to which Canada's Indigenous Languages Act of 2019 has successfully addressed the systematic barriers to language revitalization. Finally, we will explore the significant role that community-led initiatives such as immersion, schools, and language nurse plays in sustaining indigenous linguistic diversity and ensuring the transmission of these languages to future generations. Our objectives are threefold. First, we will analyze the historical and ongoing effects of colonial policies on the erosion of indigenous languages, tracing the impact from the colonial era to the present day. Second, we will evaluate the effectiveness of Canada's legal frameworks and policies in promoting equitable language revitalization, assessing their strengths and weaknesses. Finally, we will identify successful community-driven strategies that have proven effective in sustaining indigenous languages, offering valuable insights for future revitalization efforts.
Good day everyone, my name is Ashley and I'm going to discuss about historical context. Linguistic and political background. Prior to colonization, indigenous languages thrived across diverse territories, reflecting the sovereignty and cultural richness of First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples. For example, the Algonquian and Iroquoian and Dene language families spanned vast regions, each tied to unique governance systems and ecological knowledge. However, the imposition of European colonialism, beginning in the 16th century, disrupted these linguistic landscapes. The 1763 Royal Proclamation and subsequent treaties often ignored indigenous linguistic rights, cementing English and French as dominant political languages. Colonial or post-independence language development. First is residential schools in the year 1870s to 1996. So what happened? So the goal of this is the Canadian government and churches, for example Catholic and Anglican, ran residential schools to assimilate indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. Over 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were taken from their families and forbidden to speak their languages. Punishments for using indigenous languages included beatings, humiliation, or forced labor. So what is the impact of this? This disrupted the passing of languages from elders to youth. By the 1990s, many indigenous languages lost fluent speakers. For example, the Mohawk language saw a 90% decline in speakers due to these policies. So the legacy today is only 13.6% of indigenous people in Canada speak their ancestral language at home today. And survivors describe losing their language as losing a core part of their identity. Next, we have official bilingualism in the year 1969. What happened? The Official Languages Act 1969 declared English and French as Canada's only official languages. Indigenous languages were excluded. The consequences is schools, courts, and government services operated solely in English or French, ignoring indigenous languages. Indigenous languages, radio, or TV programs were rare, and indigenous leaders had to use English or French in legal negotiations. For example, in Nunavut, where Inuktitut is widely spoken, government documents were often only available in English until the 2000s. Then we have post-1980s recognition. So what happened? After decades of indigenous activism and growing awareness of colonial harms, Canada began to slowly acknowledge indigenous language rights starting in the 1980s. The grassroots activism. Indigenous communities took the lead in reviving their language through local efforts, like first, the immersion schools. For example, the Onkawen na Kent Yakwa Mohawk Immersion Program in Ontario. So what happened? Parents and elders created schools where children learned Mohawk as their first language. These rebuilt intergenerational connections and produced new fluent speakers. The impact of this is by 2020, over 500 students graduated from Mohawk immersion programs, helping reverse language decline. And then, the next is the landmark court cases. For example, Van der Peet in 1996. What happened? The Supreme Court of Canada ruled that Indigenous rights like fishing or cultural practices must be protected under the Constitution. This indirectly supported language rights as part of cultural survival. The impact of this is it became a tool for communities to argue for language programs in schools and government services. Lastly, we have the 2019 Indigenous Languages Act. What happened? In 2019, Canada passed the Indigenous Languages Act after years of advocacy by Indigenous groups. The key promises are recognize Indigenous languages as a right and provide $334 million over 5 years, about $67 million per year for language programs. The progress is the law acknowledges that languages like Cree, Inuktitut, and Michif are vital to Indigenous identity. For example, funds have supported digital tools like the First Voices app, which teaches Indigenous languages.